I want to start with a question that sounds simple and is not. When you made a decision this morning what to eat, whether to hit snooze, how to respond to a message, did you actually choose? Or did something choose for you? A combination of your genetics, your upbringing, your brain chemistry, the specific configuration of neurons that fired in that moment, a chain of causes that stretches back before you were born? Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Claire, and today I'm flying solo. This is the first of several episodes where one of us takes a topic alone when the material calls for a single voice rather than a conversation. And free will is that kind of topic, not because it does not deserve debate, but because I want to take you through the full terrain carefully, without rushing, and land somewhere honest. What does it actually mean to be free? What have the best thinkers across history actually said about it? Not the cartoon versions, not the undergraduate seminar cliches, but the real arguments taken seriously. And does it matter practically in the life you are actually living, whether free will exists or not? Those are the questions for today. Big ideas. Let's go. Most people, if you ask them whether they have free will, say yes. Of course, I make choices all the time. I decided to listen to this podcast. I could have done something else. Nobody forced me. And that intuition, the felt sense of authorship over your own actions, is real and important and should not be dismissed. But the philosophical question is not whether you experience choosing. You clearly do. The question is what that experience actually is. Whether the sense of authorship corresponds to something real, whether there is a you standing outside the chain of causes, genuinely initiating action, or whether the experience of choosing is itself just another event in the causal chain. That distinction matters. Because if the second picture is closer to the truth, if what we call a choice is just the subjective experience of a brain state that was itself determined by prior causes, then a lot of things we take for granted become philosophically complicated. Moral responsibility, punishment, praise, the whole architecture of how we relate to each other as agents who could have done otherwise. So, let us be clear about what is actually at stake. There are three main positions philosophers take on free will, and I want to name them before we go any further. Hard determinism says the universe is a closed causal system. Every event, including every mental event, every decision, every action, is the inevitable result of prior causes operating according to physical laws. Free will, in any meaningful sense, does not exist. We are sophisticated machines who believe we are choosing, but are not. Libertarian free will, and this has nothing to do with politics. It is the philosophical term says. No, determinism is not the whole story. Human beings have genuine agency. There is something about the will, or the self, or consciousness that is not fully captured by the causal story. We are not just dominoes falling, we are genuine originators of action. Compatibilism says you are asking the wrong question. Free will and determinism are not actually in conflict. What we mean by free will, acting from your own desires and reasons without external coercion, is perfectly consistent with a deterministic universe. The question is not whether your actions have causes. Everything has causes. The question is what kind of causes they have. Are they yours, or are they someone else's? Those are the three main camps. And where you land has enormous consequences for ethics, for law, for how you think about yourself and the people around you. So let us go through each one carefully. I also want to flag something about the word freedom before we go further, because it carries more than one meaning, and conflating them is where a lot of this debate goes wrong. There is political freedom, the absence of external coercion, the right to act without interference from others. There is psychological freedom, the ability to act from your own reasons rather than compulsion or fear. And there is metaphysical freedom, the kind we have been discussing, the idea that you could have done otherwise in some deep causal sense. Much of the everyday experience of freedom is about the first two kinds. The philosophical debate is primarily about the third. And a lot of confusion arises from people talking past each other because they have different kinds of freedom in mind. I want to say one more thing about what is really at stake here before we get into the arguments. The free will debate is sometimes presented as purely theoretical, the kind of thing philosophers argue about and nothing actually changes. I think that is wrong. How you answer this question shapes how you respond when you make a serious mistake. Whether you think you deserve the good life you have or just got lucky. How much compassion you extend to people who seem to have chosen badly. Whether punishment should be about retribution or rehabilitation. Whether praise is something people earn or just something that feels good to give. These are not abstract stakes. They are the texture of how you live with yourself and other people. The determinist case begins with a simple observation. You are a physical thing. Your brain is made of matter. Matter operates according to physical laws. And physical laws, as best as we can tell, are deterministic, or if they are not fully deterministic at the quantum level, they are random, which is not the same as free. Randomness does not give you freedom, it gives you noise. Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch philosopher, put this most starkly. Spinoza argued that everything that exists is part of a single infinite substance, what he called God or nature, and that everything that happens is a necessary expression of that substance's nature. There is no gap in the causal chain where self could insert itself. The feeling of freedom, Spinoza said, is just ignorance of causes. We feel free because we are unaware of the forces that are actually driving us. This is a genuinely challenging position, and I do not think it should be dismissed quickly. Spinoza was not a cynic. He was not trying to depress anyone. He thought that understanding necessity, really understanding it, not just intellectually accepting it, was the path to a kind of peace. If you know that everything is as it had to be, including your own suffering and your own failures, the emotional charge around those things changes. You stop fighting what cannot be otherwise. That is his version of liberation. Not freedom from causes, but freedom from the illusion that you could have escaped them. Spinoza's positive vision deserves more than a summary, because it is one of the most interesting responses to the problem ever offered. He did not think understanding determinism should make you passive or resigned. He thought it should make you rational. The more clearly you understand the causes of your own behavior, the desires, the fears, the historical conditions that shaped you, the less enslaved by them you are, not because you can escape them, but because understanding a cause changes your relationship to it. You stop experiencing your anger as a force that simply happens to you and start recognizing it as something arising from specific conditions you can identify and sometimes address. That is a form of freedom, even within a deterministic framework. Not freedom from causes, but freedom through understanding them. The contemporary neuroscience version of this argument is less elegant, but possibly more persuasive to a modern ear. Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s asked people to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it, while monitoring their brain activity. What he found was startling. The brain showed a buildup of electrical activity, the readiness potential, several hundred milliseconds before the person reported being aware of the intention to move. The brain had already started preparing the action before the conscious self had, apparently, decided to take it. The popular interpretation of Libet's results was, free will is an illusion. Your conscious mind does not initiate action. It is informed of action after the fact and takes credit for it. You are not the author of your behavior, you are the narrator. Now, Libet's experiments have been extensively criticized and refined in the decades since, and the interpretation is considerably more contested than the popular summary suggests. But the underlying challenge they represent, that consciousness may not be where the decisions are actually being made, remains serious and unresolved. And it sits at the center of what makes the free will debate so genuinely hard. There is a thought experiment that I think captures the determinist intuition better than any technical argument. Imagine you could rewind the universe to the moment before a decision you made, not just the external circumstances, but everything, including the exact state of your brain, every neuron, every electrochemical gradient, every particle. Everything is identical to the moment before the original choice. The question the determinist asks is, could you have chosen differently? If the universe is governed by physical laws, and if everything about you at that moment was identical to what it was, the answer seems to be no. The choice would come out the same. And if the choice could not have come out differently, in what sense was it really a choice? That argument is simple and powerful and does not depend on any particular neuroscience. It just asks you to take seriously what it means for the physical world to be lawful. And if you do take it seriously, the consequences ripple outward. Not just for how we think about our own choices, but for how we think about criminal justice, about moral luck, about whether anyone really deserves anything at all. The libertarian free will position the view that we have genuine, robust freedom of the kind that is not reducible to prior causes has taken many forms across history, and I want to be fair to its best versions, rather than the ones that are easiest to dismiss. The oldest and most intuitive version is dualist. René Descartes argued that mind and body are two distinct substances. The body operates mechanically, yes, but the mind, the soul, the thinking thing is not material. It is not governed by physical laws in the same way, and it is through this non-material mind that genuine freedom is possible. The will is not just another physical event. The problems with Cartesian dualism are well known and do not need lengthy treatment here. If the mind is genuinely non-material, how does it interact with the body? How does an immaterial will move a material hand? Descartes never solved this, and the attempted solutions have not fared much better. Most philosophers today find strict dualism untenable as a physical account of the world, even if they are sympathetic to what it is trying to preserve. A more sophisticated contemporary version of libertarian free will comes from philosophers like Robert Caine, who tries to ground genuine freedom in the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics. If the universe is genuinely indeterministic at the fundamental level, if there is real randomness built into the fabric of things, then the causal chain is not as closed as the hard determinists suggest. Caine argues that at certain critical junctures, when we are genuinely deliberating between options, quantum-level indeterminacy in the brain can give rise to genuine openness, genuine alternative possibilities. The problem with this move, as many philosophers have noted, is that randomness is not freedom. If my decision to forgive someone or betray them comes down to a quantum fluctuation, that does not feel like an expression of my agency. It feels like chance. And chance is not what we mean when we talk about moral responsibility. We do not praise or blame people for being lucky. What the libertarian position is really trying to preserve, and I think this is important to name clearly, is the intuition of genuine authorship. The sense that when I make a decision, it is really me making it. That there is a self that stands behind the choice and owns it in a way that cannot be fully captured by listing the prior causes. And that intuition is not obviously wrong. It is the bedrock of how we live together as moral and legal beings. The question is whether it corresponds to anything real in the metaphysical structure of the world, or whether it is an indispensable fiction. Immanuel Kant had the most philosophically sophisticated version of this position, and it is worth understanding even if you ultimately do not accept it. Kant argued that there are two standpoints from which we can view human action. From the standpoint of nature, the third-person scientific perspective, everything is determined. We can in principle explain every action as the result of prior causes. But from the standpoint of practical reason, the first-person perspective of an agent deliberating about what to do, we necessarily presuppose freedom. You cannot deliberate without assuming that your deliberation makes a difference. The very act of asking, "What should I do?" takes for granted that the answer is not already fixed. Kant's solution was to say that both standpoints are legitimate, and neither undermines the other. As a natural object, you are determined. As a rational agent, you are free. These are not contradictory claims about the same thing. They are different ways of describing the same entity from different vantage points. It is an elegant move, and I think it captures something true about the phenomenology of deliberation, even if it leaves the metaphysical question somewhat unresolved. Compatibilism is probably the position held by the majority of professional philosophers today, and I think it deserves careful treatment because it is often misrepresented, dismissed as a trick, a way of changing the subject rather than answering the question. I do not think that is fair, and I want to explain why. The compatibilist move, at its simplest, is to ask, what do we actually mean by free will? Not in the abstract metaphysical sense, but in the sense that matters, for how we live for moral responsibility, for praise and blame, for the difference between someone who acts freely and someone who is coerced. When we say someone acted freely, we typically mean something like, they acted from their own desires and reasons, without being forced by external pressure, without being under duress, without acting from compulsion or addiction or mental illness that bypass their normal deliberative processes. We contrast free action not with determined action, but with coerced action, with actions that do not reflect who the person actually is. David Hume made this point in the 18th century, and it remains one of the cleanest formulations. Liberty is a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. If I choose to remain at rest, I may. If I choose to move, I also may. Now, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. The determinist picture does not threaten this kind of freedom at all. Harry Frankfurt, one of the most influential contemporary philosophers on this question, developed what he called the hierarchical theory of free will. Frankfurt's idea is that what matters for freedom is not whether your desires have causes, they always do, but whether you identify with those desires, whether you endorse them on reflection. A person who acts from a desire they want to have, that they reflectively affirm as their own, is acting freely, even if that desire was itself caused. A person who acts from a desire they are enslaved to an addiction, a compulsion, a fear they desperately want to be free of, is not acting freely, even if determinism is false. What this means in practice is that freedom is a matter of the relationship between different levels of your psychology, not a metaphysical property of your will. It is about integration, about whether your actions express a self that is coherent and reflective, rather than about standing outside the causal order. I find this genuinely compelling, and I want to say why before I also say what I think it leaves unresolved. The compatibilist picture saves what is actually important about free will, the basis for moral responsibility, the distinction between persons and mechanisms, the genuine difference between freely choosing and being forced without requiring a metaphysical miracle. It works with the world as we actually find it, and it explains why most of our ordinary practices of praise and blame and accountability survive the determinism challenge intact. What it does not fully resolve, I think, is the question of ultimate origination. Even if my action expresses my desire, and my desire is one I endorse on reflection, the fact remains that I did not ultimately choose to be the kind of person who has those desires. My character, my values, my reflective endorsements, these too have causes, and at some point the regress bottoms out in facts about me that I did not choose. The compatibilist can say, yes, but that is all there is, and it is enough. The hard determinist can say, you have just described a sophisticated causal mechanism and called it freedom. That debate has not been definitively settled. There is also the problem of moral luck, first articulated clearly by Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams, which I think is the most philosophically uncomfortable implication of the whole discussion. The problem is this: we routinely judge people differently based on factors that were entirely outside their control. Two drivers run a red light in identical conditions. One reaches the other side safely. The other hits a child who ran into the street. We treat them very differently, morally, legally, psychologically, even though, from the perspective of what they actually chose and intended, they did exactly the same thing. The outcome, which neither of them controlled, shapes the moral verdict. Williams and Nagel were not saying this is justified. They were saying it is how we actually operate, and that it creates a deep tension at the heart of moral thinking. If moral responsibility requires control, and so much of what we are and what happens to us is outside our control, then the scope of genuine moral responsibility may be much narrower than we usually assume. The compatibilists can live with this. They can say, responsibility tracks what is under your control and nothing more. But it means being honest about how little control we actually have over the things that matter most. Before I get to what I think is the most important question, I want to name something that often goes unspoken in the free will debate. Both sides tend to present their position as if the stakes were purely intellectual. But positions on free will are almost always entangled with deeper commitments about what makes a good life, about what we owe each other, about whether the universe is just. Hard determinists often have a progressive political sensibility. If people are shaped by their conditions, then changing conditions is what matters, not punishing individuals. Libertarians about free will often have a more individualist sensibility. People are genuinely responsible, and that responsibility must be honored. Neither of these is simply a philosophical error. They reflect different intuitions about human dignity and social organization that go very deep. Knowing that does not resolve the debate, but it helps explain why it persists with such intensity. So here is the question I want to spend the last part of this episode on, because I think it is the one that actually matters for the life you are living. Does any of this make a difference? If you became convinced, really convinced, not just intellectually entertained, that hard determinism was true and free will was an illusion, what would change? The pessimistic answer is a lot. Dirk Pereboom, a philosopher who argues for what he calls hard incompatibilism, is honest about this. If we do not have free will in the libertarian sense, if no one could really have done otherwise than retributive punishment, the idea that people deserve to suffer for what they have done loses its justification. You cannot deserve punishment for something you could not have helped doing. The whole edifice of blame-based moral thinking is in trouble. But Pereboom does not think this leads to nihilism. He thinks it should lead to a reform of how we think about moral responsibility away from desert and toward consequentialism. We can still restrain dangerous people. We can still use incentives and disincentives to shape behavior. We can still express moral attitudes toward actions. What we cannot do, with intellectual honesty, is claim that the person at the center of those practices deserved exactly what they got because they were the ultimate author of their choice. The optimistic answer, and this is the one I find myself more drawn to, is that the implications for daily life are smaller than the metaphysical stakes suggest. Here is why. Whatever is true about the deep structure of causation and freedom, you are still the locus of deliberation. The decisions still run through you. The reasons still matter because reasoning is itself part of the causal process that produces action. If you think more carefully, you are more likely to act in accordance with your deeper values. If you examine your assumptions, you are more likely to catch yourself before acting from prejudice or fear. The fact that this process has causes does not make it pointless. It makes it exactly as important as you thought it was. There is also a psychological dimension worth naming. Belief in free will, even a compatibilist version, appears to be associated with better outcomes. Research by Roy Baumeister and others suggests that people who are induced to doubt their free will behave less ethically, are less persistent in the face of difficulty, and take less responsibility for their actions. The belief that you are the author of your choices seems to be functionally important for living well, regardless of the metaphysical truth behind it. Which raises a strange question. Is it better to believe in free will, even if it is not, strictly speaking, true? I do not think the answer is yes. I think living on a false belief is always a cost, even when the false belief is useful. But I do think it points towards something important, that the question of free will is not purely theoretical. It has real consequences for how you relate to yourself, to other people, and to the choices you make every day. Here is what I think the most honest answer looks like. The metaphysical question whether we have libertarian free will, whether we could in some deep sense have done otherwise, is probably not resolvable given our current understanding of physics and consciousness. We do not know enough about how the brain generates experience, about whether quantum indeterminacy plays any functional role in neural processing, or about what a complete physical account of deliberation would look like. Anyone who tells you the question is settled is overreaching. But the practical question how you should relate to yourself and others given the uncertainty is more tractable. And my answer is, take your agency seriously, hold your judgments about others more lightly, and let the encounter with this question make you more curious about the conditions that shape human behavior rather than less. That is not a complete philosophy, but it is a starting orientation. And starting orientations are where everything else begins. I want to step back for a moment before I say where I land, because I think one thing this episode has been trying to do is resist the temptation to resolve the question too quickly. The free will debate has been going on for centuries. The fact that it is not settled is not a failure of philosophy. It reflects genuine difficulty, genuine uncertainty about the nature of consciousness, causation, and what it means to be a person. Anyone who tells you the answer is obvious, on either side, is probably not taking the full force of the opposing argument seriously. With that said, I want to be honest about where I land, because I think that is what this format is for. Not just presenting the positions, but actually saying something. I am a compatibilist. Not because compatibilism is the easy way out, I think it is actually a demanding position, one that requires you to think carefully about what you mean by freedom, and to give up the satisfying but probably incoherent picture of a self that stands outside causation. But because I think it is the most honest description of what freedom actually is, when you look carefully at the cases that matter, the difference between someone who chooses freely and someone who is coerced is real and important. The difference between someone who acts from reasons they endorse and someone enslaved to compulsions they hate is real and important. Those distinctions do not require a ghost in the machine. They require a careful account of how deliberation works and what it means for an action to express a self rather than bypass it. What I find most unsettling about the free will debate is not the metaphysics, it is the question of luck. I did not choose my brain, my temperament, my early environment, the language in which I learned to think, the particular fears and loves that were laid down before I was old enough to examine them. So much of what I call my character was given to me before I had any say, and that is uncomfortable to sit with. Not because it means I am not responsible for what I do, I think I am, but because it should make me much more humble about the moral weight I attach to other people's failures. The person who made the worst choice you can think of, the one it is easiest to condemn, was also, at some point, a child with a particular brain and a particular set of circumstances. That does not make the choice acceptable. It does not mean there should be no consequences, but it should complicate the certainty with which we feel that they simply deserved whatever happened to them. The luck runs deeper than we want to admit, and I think that is actually the most important practical implication of the free will debate, not whether punishment is justified, not whether determinism is true, but whether the encounter with this question makes you a little more willing to extend to other people the same understanding you would want extended to yourself, to hold your judgments a little more lightly, to ask, before the verdict, what were the forces they were working with and against. I also want to say something about what this conversation does to how I think about my own past. There are choices I have made that I am not proud of, things I did that I would do differently now. And I used to think about those the way most people do, as failures of will, as moments when I could have done better and did not. The free will debate has not absolved me of those, but it has changed the emotional register. I am less interested in flagellating myself for being the person I was then, and more interested in understanding what I was working with and against. That feels like a more honest and more useful relationship to my own history. Sean will be back next week with his own solo episode. But I wanted to end here, alone, because I think the question of free will is ultimately a question you have to sit with yourself. There is no Sean to disagree with me, no back and forth to hide behind, just the question. And the fact that I am here, asking it, and you are there, listening, and whether either of us could have done otherwise, we are both doing it. Next week, Sean takes the solo seat for an episode on grief, what philosophy has to offer in the face of loss. From Boethius writing in a prison cell, to Camus on absurdity, to contemporary work on grief as a form of love. It is an episode for anyone who has lost someone. And it is one of the most important conversations we will have this season. If this episode made you think or unsettled something you thought you had settled, share it. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for. Sources and further reading are in the show notes. We are Philosophy for Lunch, new episodes every Sunday. Big ideas. Human conversations. See you next week.